All right, everybody. Thank you guys so much for coming to join us today. I'm Elizabeth Reynolds. I run U.S. operations for Starburst Aerospace. You're probably wondering why we are talking about aerospace and in conjunction with Medtech and the FDA. We're here because we launched our first program this year focusing on human health in space and microgravity research opportunities. And there's not something more complicated, I don't think, that could be done than tackling both space and medicine. So we're really happy to be here today and to help demystify some of the process around the FDA and talk about opportunities in medtech broadly. So we're going to kick off today with a panel discussion, just really talking about the state of the industry, entrepreneurship, investment. And I'm really happy to be here today with Felicia and Monica. Thank you for joining me today. So we'll kick off. I'll let you guys give a little bit of introduction for yourselves and how you ended up where you are today.
Hey, everyone. So I'm Felicia. I am an engineer, physician, now investor. So I studied biological engineering at MIT, did a lot of nanoparticle work, drug delivery, with Bob Langer, and Sangeeta Bhatia, and then was at Harvard for medical school, and then came back out where this is home for me. So I was doing my internal medicine residency at UCLA and then switched to the dark side and am now an investor at Bold Capital Partners. Do you want me to give a brief overview of Bold, or?
Yeah, that'd be
Okay.
great.
So Bold is a relatively small to medium-sized VC firm. So we're a tech bio firm, and we have about $500 million under management across 3 funds. We just closed our 3rd fund yesterday. So big week. I literally did none of that work, but and so we are focused at this point about 2/3 in healthcare and 1/3 not. And our check sizes tend to be between $1 to $4 million, and our sweet spot is Series A.
Hello. Okay. Hi there. I'm Monica Jain. I will start with the same intro as over here. So I did biomedical engineering and then went on to medical school, both at Boston University. I'm from Arizona, so close enough to here, and really wanted to get back to the warm weather. Came back to Cedars-Sinai to do my general surgery residency. Went to UCSF to do endocrine surgery fellowship, and then came back and am now a practicing general and endocrine surgeon for the majority of my time. I am also a venture partner at Wavemaker Three-Sixty Health as of the past 6 months or so. So I'm here. Kwame is my partner, one of the organizers of the event. So Wavemaker Three-Sixty Health is an early stage healthcare-focused venture fund. We work in digital health and medical devices, no biopharma, and we focus on the seed stage, writing checks between $500,000 and $1.25 million. And we really have deep expertise in healthcare. So we have everyone from physicians like myself to FDA experts like Kwame, serial entrepreneurs. A lot of our LPs are physicians, executives at payer organizations, executives at hospitals. So really deep expertise in the area. And we use that to our advantage to help our portfolio companies rapidly commercialize and get traction in the space. So I also do a lot of work in human factors and ergonomics, so doing human factors studies for device design, very familiar with the FDA process for commercialization from that standpoint. And that's about me.
Wonderful. I really appreciate you both being here today. And you chose a really interesting time to enter the venture landscape. When we talk about entrepreneurship and investment in biomed today, it's very different than it was 10 years ago. We've seen huge changes with things like COVID that have brought a lot of additional capital and a lot of other changes to the landscape. As you look at the world today, what are some of the trends that you're seeing, and what do you think is the future of entrepreneurship and investment in medtech?
So specifically for medical devices, I really see a lot of point of care diagnostics and therapeutics really taking the stage. It's an ode to personalized medicine and really making sure that each individual understands their own health and then also can manage their own health. So I think that that's something that's really important right now. And in general, precision medicine is really taking the world by storm. So precision medicine as a whole in terms of digital health, diagnostics, therapeutics, pharma, precision medicine is really where the headwinds are.
Yeah, I have a pretty similar answer too. And to even expand on what Monica is saying about sort of who has the power, so to speak. And I think when you're thinking about tech, before you're thinking about the physician, the hospital, they have the tech. And right now you're actually seeing like a shift of that tech from the provider back into the patient's hands. So there's a sort of a mantra that we follow at Bold, which is making people the CEO of their own health. And if you can give someone the ability to do a lot of these things from their home, whether that's remote monitoring or virtual health, which is something that ballooned during the pandemic, then I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the shift.
So you used the word tech bio earlier when describing your investment thesis. Can you speak a little bit more to that? All of that ties into these topics, but I think that may be a new term for many folks.
Yeah. So when I introduced Bold, we are a tech bio fund in the sense that we invest mostly in tech that can be applied to bio. And I think it's a really interesting mix because tech is inherently really fast, right? One thing a filter that we use is, would this technology have been able to be done 10 years ago? And if that answer is yes, then we almost won't want to look at it. Because there's the shift towards tech bio, you almost like can't see what's going to happen in 10 years because we just can't even imagine what those possibilities are right now. And so tech, I see it as the fast. Bio tends to lag behind a little bit as much as we love bio. And so I think the mix of the two will make both just kind of move along.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Felicia on that. I think one of the things that I think about when I hear tech bio is that it's very data driven and that it's all about using the data to the greatest potential and utilizing that data to develop diagnostics and therapeutics much faster than in the past, where a lot of times we were doing many other tests, sitting in a lab, pipetting, trying to kind of individually test individual devices or molecules or whatever it may be. And now we're able to use data from prior to really extrapolate a lot of diagnostics, therapeutics, and other interventions. And so that's where I really see tech bio being very different than the traditional way that we have developed innovations in medicine to date.
So as we talk about this personalized medicine and precision medicine, what does kind of the potential here look like for you? What is the end game here as we're able to really look at genetic code and really take advantage of all this data that we're just beginning to understand?
Well, I would look at the patient journey, right? So you have a patient who's sitting at home, utilizing point of care at home devices to understand earlier when they're getting sick, when they need to go to the hospital, when they need to go to a different type of facility, which may not be the hospital. So I can send you to a virtual appointment with a nurse practitioner or physician assistant, or I can send you to an urgent care, something like that, being able to enable those patients to do some testing at home rather than have to go in somewhere to get testing done. And then if they do end up with a sickness that requires them to go in person to a clinic or a hospital, that at that hospital or clinic, they're able to utilize the patient's genetic information and past medical history to the greatest extent to provide them with very personalized treatments, and also enable the diagnostics to provide better prognoses and things like that. So I kind of look at it on the continuum of the patient's journey, that's really the optimal. And a lot of the optimization comes from getting patients more care at home where they're more comfortable, getting patients to the right places for escalation of care, and then also on the other side, enabling better diagnostics and therapeutics.
And then I'll add even just also one tiny caveat, which is when you think about personalized medicine, I think the predictive part of it is really important. Like what Monica said, detect early. That's the best thing that you can do. Where it gets a little bit tricky, and we actually see a lot of companies that claim that they can do this, is when you get down to the level of almost like microdosing, personalized for you, then it starts bordering a little bit on unrealistic. So just being mindful of that and not misusing the word personalized is really important.
As we talk about all of this, data is obviously a very sensitive topic broadly, and certainly in healthcare. And when we think particularly about some of the monitoring at home, people often speak of this in a kind of integrated home fashion where there are sensors monitoring your every move. What do you think what are some of the dangers that come with this data? What are the hurdles that we face with not having enough data? And like what changes really need to happen both kind of culturally and on a system level to capitalize on all this?
Data. I could probably talk about data for a very long time. I think it's a bit of a catch-22. So data has the ability, I mean, it's transformed innovation, right? And especially when you look at healthcare, there's so much data. And it's a bit ironic because healthcare is like this giant treasure chest of possible insights, right, from patient data. At the same time, healthcare holds on, at least healthcare systems, I'm kind of thinking of it in that lens, they hold on to their data so tightly that you almost can't do the analytics on it. And so that's actually why they're also lagging behind. So I actually see that as a very sweet spot to target that. If you can somehow eliminate some of those barriers to getting that data, is one thing. That's just from the healthcare system side. I think a risk reduction is just thinking about security, because there is a huge risk when all of your data is somewhere and you can't really visualize where it is. And if it gets hacked, right, there's all of that. So important to keep in mind.
For me, there's a couple areas. One is the data analysis portion, and one is the payer portion. So one is that physicians or any care providers cannot possibly analyze all of the data that exists out there. And so part of just obtaining more data involves the analysis of that data, and making it easier for people to analyze and understand the data that they're being provided with. A lot of the developments right now also include developing new data points. And so measurements that are objective now that we've never had before, that were always subjective, things like that. And so understanding what that data means, and also summarizing a lot of that data is a huge hurdle to having more data coming from the home. So like, what does it mean that a patient is walking less or something like that? Does that mean that they're getting sick? Does that mean that they're getting depressed? What does that mean? And how, as a healthcare provider, can I act on that? The other side of that is that with more data coming from the patients, there is a risk to the patients for I would say bias in healthcare insurance, right? So any healthcare insurance, you have your preconditions, and that makes your healthcare insurance more expensive. But with more data coming from the home, for me, that means that if a patient is walking less and a payer knows that, then they can say, well, you're not active enough, and activity is associated with heart disease, or decreased activity is associated with heart disease. And so I'm going to charge you more because you are more likely to have heart disease in the future because you're not as active as your neighbor. So that to me is a potential for significant bias and prejudice and difficulty in patients getting the health care that they deserve and have a right to. So I think that that's something that should be addressed from a policy standpoint.
And actually, one more thing to add too is it's not just about the quantity of data. You need good data, right? Like when you think about AI, there's that saying garbage in, garbage out. You actually need good data. So even just curating good data sets is another problem of its own.
Particularly if patients are in charge of monitoring themselves. So as we talk about different ways that patients can potentially take vitals and produce data at home, I've seen a lot more discussion around the tricorder analogy, right? Like how, we are certainly seeing a lot of innovation in handheld medical devices, devices that have a lot more automation and capability built in. What are some of the things that excite you in that field? And are there areas where we really need innovation to continue to produce the data needed?
Some things that really excite me in the home data area are actually devices that are the least intrusive to the way that we interact in our daily lives. So things that don't require you to wear a watch. So as an example, elders especially have a lot of difficulty wearing a watch and understanding how to interact with that and set it up and do all of those sorts of things. And so if you have a way to get data from them that does not involve wearing a watch or have a device that they have to set up in a complicated manner, then you're going to get a lot more data from them. And that I think is important when you're talking about getting data from home. So that's what really excites me is things that are the least intrusive to the way that patients or people really conduct themselves at home.
Yeah, one of my favorite companies that Bull is invested in is called AliveCore. And it's the perfect I'm seeing some nods. It's the perfect example of a device that they've taken the 12 lead or technically 6 lead EKG and made it into a form factor that's the size of a credit card. So it even fits into your wallet like any other credit card. And all you do is put 2 fingers, one from the left hand, one from the right hand, and then you can see your EKG. And so that's something that's really easy to understand and actually makes it so that people are able to use it very easily.
What are some of the trends that you're seeing in a hospital setting and within the medical care system?
So a lot of the trends in the hospital setting have to do with data analysis. So using AI to analyze the troves of data that we get in a hospital that we can't possibly analyze just looking at an electronic medical record and clicking through a bunch of tabs on the electronic medical record. So being able to analyze that data and then present useful insights related to that data. And then the other parts of it are automating a lot of the care that can be automated such that physicians don't have to think so much about the routine things that they do and can focus more on caring for patients, talking to them, spending time discussing diagnoses and prognoses and other things with their patients and not have to worry about all of the other small things in order to get someone the imaging that they need or what kinds of therapeutics they need. So I think that's what I'm really seeing in the hospitals.
Yeah, innovation in the hospital is a little bit tricky. I think when you think about the incentives, it can be really, really, really frustrating to get them aligned. And I think just to take AI as an example, ideally, every single AI vendor out there wants the analytics, right, to be implemented within a hospital system to get the insights. Ultimately, right now, I think there's a bit of a lag. And I was actually just talking to a CIO of a really big hospital institution today. And he was saying, radiology aside, I think they're the ones who are light years ahead. But everyone else, even when it comes to AI and data, they're looking a little bit more at operations and staffing, and which is understandable because they're looking at all the 10 fires that they have to put out. So we're actually seeing a lot of automation and insights for operations, less so on the clinical care side. But I think that'll come in the next 10 to 15 years.
I would like to add one interim between those two, which is the outpatient space, which is very different than the at-home or the hospital spaces. And in the outpatient space, we're seeing what I discussed before, which is new ways to look at things that were very subjective previously. And so, understanding anything from x-rays and bone health to hormone evaluations and kind of genetics, everything in between, that allows outpatient physicians to better understand things that were semi-subjective or just not really data-driven previously. And so there's a very interesting area of like point of care diagnostics that are developing new measures. And so one, that makes it a little bit more difficult for physicians to be able to adapt to new technologies. And there's kind of a big adoption hurdle there. But I think that if companies are able to navigate that, then that is an excellent way to really transform patient care, because we're making a lot of what was subjective and like the doctor who has a lot of experience, who's seen this a bunch of times before, understands way better than the novice physician who's there. Allows all of those people to get on the same page and provide the same high quality care to all of the patients who are coming into their offices.
That's really great. Yeah. And all of these trends that we've been talking about are things that are of great interest when we look at space health and we talk about humans being in orbit or further. We really need the same level of automation. We need all this data. Remote care is an option on the ISS, but it won't be further on. And so we're looking at many of these same challenges and on a smaller scale. But I think a lot about how that can be applied to resource poor areas here in the Earth. When we're looking for both, we're talking about areas where there may be a lack of connectivity, a lack of resources, and how do you provide that same high level of care? And certainly with some of the challenges that we face globally today, I think this becomes really relevant. Are you guys looking at doing investments in areas that focus on providing care in these kind of remote areas? And what are some of the things that you think are most important there?
Absolutely. I mean, so we do a lot of co-investments with the Gates Foundation. So very global health focused. There's actually a stealth company that's coming out of MIT. Actually, I don't think I can name it yet. Now I'm going to get in trouble.
Come on, just between us.
Yeah, there's a Zoom. And they're actually working on a vaccine that you actually just need to give once. And it's a type of drug delivery that can self-boost itself. So I think when you think about resource limited areas, it's almost thinking, can you actually, which is counterintuitive, can you actually decrease the number of times this person needs to interface with the provider? And if you can do that, then they can actually just go longer in a safe way without having to do that. So that's kind of one approach.
Yes, definitely. Contrary to what you were saying before, which doesn't quite apply to space, telehealth and telerobotics are definitely really big areas. I'm a surgeon, so I'm super interested in telerobotics and understanding how telemedicine can really enhance surgery in terms of, again, allowing the experts to coach the novices in the area, or just to allow the experts to do the operations or the procedures themselves from wherever they may be in these resource poor areas where they don't have access to those experts. So that's definitely a really interesting space that we're looking into right now. Separately, just looking at how people can have their own guidance systems. So anything from guidance related to doing ultrasounds to guidance for what steps to take in order to take care of yourself before you have to escalate your care. I think those are things that really help in the rural medicine space.
Absolutely. Just one follow-on to that. Where are we in the cultural shift in accepting some of these diagnoses from technology?
So I'll start. Kwame and I were Kwame and I were at the Mayo Clinic recently, and I will tell you that it was a room full of surgeons, and a lot of the surgeons were very opposed to telerobotics. They said that there was still a lot of lag time in the technology. For me personally, a lot of difficulty with the human factors and adoption components of it in terms of understanding if there is a complication, how you would manage that in a telemedicine fashion for someone who may have an acute bleed after a procedure from a telerobotic operation, and who's managing that and how. So there is still a lot of resistance, and I think that there needs to be a lot of work done in those spaces to really have acceptance from providers. That being said, a lot of patients, on the other hand, are very excited about these opportunities because they get access to Cedars-Sinai and Mayo Clinic and UCLA level care, even though they live in areas where they are 200-300 miles from the nearest center, let alone 1,000 miles from the nearest expert in the area that they need. And so I think that patients are a lot more excited. Providers have a lot of hesitation.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're sort of seeing. And I'll just give an example too, in terms of the resistance from providers. So when you think about radiology, right? Radiology is actually very ahead of some of the other departments in terms of adopting technology. And for an example, AI. And even then, when you pitch like an AI company gets pitched to a radiology department, they don't want to know that you're going to increase their clinical accuracy by 5%. No, that'll be the instant turnoff, right? And they want to know, oh, you'll actually just let us have a higher throughput, crunch more things out. They don't want to know that you're going to do better than them. And so I think there's a bit of an ego, which is understandable, right? They went through a lot of school to get there. And so I think there's a bit of that cultural gap still, that we still have to make way. That being said, I think having it as like a second hand, kind of like an alert system or something that you can say, hey, it's almost like having someone to just catch you, the Swiss cheese model, I think is what it's called. To have that, then you start having the ears open up a little bit more, but.
Yeah, definitely can agree on that. Surgeons especially have a God complex, and it's really bad. So yeah, surgeons definitely, especially there's a high risk of not having them listen to anything that you want to say.
That being said, if you're a startup and you're working in a medical device space and you show that you've had surgeons, I'm just going to say that as the example, surgeons who are coming to visit you and do a site visit because they're that interested in your product, then that's like 3 green flags for a VC.
It's amazing. And building off that, this is a very competitive landscape today. There is both a lot more capital. There's also just a lot more activities, a lot of opportunities for innovation kind of broadly from consumer health and wearables into the clinical setting and all the data components. What can people do to what can entrepreneurs do to give themselves an edge? What are some of the things that you're looking for as you're evaluating these companies today?
For me, because I do a lot of work in human factors and adoption, it's very important to have a KOL that's in the space. I think that's, for me especially, the number one thing that really is a green flag, that you are understanding the space, understanding who you're trying to sell to, understanding what environment you're trying to sell into, and really understanding the healthcare space as a whole, because it is very difficult to sell into. And without KOLs in the space who understand how this works in their workflow, how they would evaluate patients differently with your device, how they would treat people differently, however that is. Without a KOL in this space, you really cannot make any claims that say that you truly understand that. And so that, to me, is the most important thing, is to have KOLs in the space who understand your product, have used your product, and can say great things about it.
So the fundraising environment right now is really chaotic. There's obviously the economy is not doing super well. And I think the biggest tip that I can give from the VC perspective is just really think about at what point are you going to get a major value inflection, and figure out exactly how it is that you're going to get there. Make sure that roadmap is extremely clear, even if it means cutting out, your pipeline 3 through 5, just to make sure that 1 and 2, particular 1, actually make it, is really important, because what counted as a milestone a couple years ago just isn't enough to start raising another round. And then also just give yourself an extra buffer. So instead of the 3-month buffer of what you're going to do with these funds, carve out 6 months, or even 9 months, and just be pessimistic about it. And if from the VC side, if we see that you are being realistic / pessimistic, then we'll have more faith that you will be the team to deliver that.
Awesome. This has been really a wonderful conversation. Everyone, thank you both again for being here. And yeah, it's a really interesting time. And I'm excited for this next conversation because there is certainly, I think, a lot of tension between the rate of innovation and the rate of adoption in the clinical setting. And certainly when we look at regulation, these things are moving at very different paces today. And there's some really positive dynamic tension, but also a little difficulty there. So we're going to take just a couple minutes break here, and then we're going to come back and talk more about the FDA. All right, everybody, we're going to reconvene. There will be more time for networking and conversation here at the end. We know that's why you're all here. Don't worry. We won't short you on it. There's a little button. A little gray button. Yeah. All right. So really excited to welcome both of these people to the stage. Dina Lozofsky, who is one of our partners at UCLA, and Kwame Ulmer, who's one of the partners in throwing this event, and certainly one of the few people who it can really openly share some of the insights about what the FDA process looks like for us. So I'm going to let both of you guys give a little bit more background on yourselves and a little introduction. Then I'm going to hand it over.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have an introduction prepared for Kwame because I feel like you all should know his background, and he's probably too humble to tell you all the awesome things that he does. So as Elizabeth said, I'm Dina Lozofsky. I'm the Senior Director of Business Development at UCLA's Technology Development Group. I manage the team that licenses and patents technologies in medtech, physical sciences, and engineering, which is why I'm here and why I work with Starburst, which I love working with them. And thank you so much for inviting me tonight. But we're here to demystify the FDA. So Kwame Ulmer is founder of Medtech Impact Partners. He's a venture partner at Wavemaker Three-Sixty Health. He's a board member at California Life Sciences and a lecturer and researcher at UCLA. And that's just a subset of the things that he does. I don't know when he sleeps. A little bit of background on him. He has more than 20 years of government and private sector experience. He partners with companies to help them set a clear regulatory strategy and deliver on key milestones. He also serves as an expert witness and advises venture capital firms. Kwame established an efficient regulatory process during his time working as an operating company executive and evaluated over 1,000 technologies during his tenure at the FDA. He's also delightful to work with, which I know from personal experience. So thank you, Kwame, for your time.
Thank you, Dina. It's going to be fun.
It is going to be fun. So I have a bunch of questions to ask him, but in the spirit of this being a demystifying of FDA, if any of you have questions, want clarifications on his answers, just let us know. Don't let us be formal with you. So let's get started. So Kwame, could you break down the parts of the FDA approval process for MedTech for us?
So typically for companies like you all that are developing novel, innovative technologies, there are going to be a few main phases. You're going to build a prototype where you may have little to no interaction with the FDA and not a fully fleshed out regulatory strategy. Right around that time, you may have raised a pre-seed round or gearing up for a seed round. That's when roughly 10 to 15% of your rounds should probably be allocated to regulatory and quality, where you're building your final finished device. That's when you're going to start thinking about your indications for use, the claims you want to make, fully understanding the device and being able to describe it. That's when you will write that regulatory strategy, and probably for most of you, think about that first meeting with the FDA called a pre-submission. You may go 1 to 2, maybe 3 rounds, learning a few things, the preclinical and clinical data needed from the FDA, whether you're breakthrough or not, or eligible for another program, a baby breakthrough program called the STEP program. And all these are designed to get really patient-serving, innovative products through the FDA quicker. You'll go through that process, then you'll write your formal application. And at that point, you'll be working with a consultant that's probably going to be working shoulder to shoulder with a quality expert, a clinical expert. And for many of you, you'll be thinking about issues related to cybersecurity, et cetera. So you may have a cyber expert. You're going to have a big old team. But don't worry. By that time, you will have raised a seed extension. And by the time you raise your Series A, you're going to do that clinical study that you'll need for your de novo, your PMA, your 510K, write the application, and then voila, you'll have your marketing approval.
So that sounds...
It's just that easy.
That sounds very complicated to me. So can you break that down for us from like a timing perspective? How long does it take?
So I was fortunate enough to do some research with Jennifer McHaney, Dr. Jennifer McHaney, MIT graduate. And we learned after talking to over 100 companies that it takes roughly 2.5 years and $5 million for a 510K device to go from concept to commercialization. And that means getting through the FDA. And for a de novo product, it takes roughly 5 years and roughly $20 million to go from concept to commercialization. So it's not for the faint of heart. It is a journey. It's capital intensive, but with the right capital partners, smart capital like Dr. Monica Jain, you can get through it.
So what is a de novo product?
So de novo comes from the Latin for new. And that's just what it means. It means that the FDA has never seen a technology like this, which is great. And that's the good news. The bad news is it's going to take a longer regulatory review process. The timeline is longer. Typically, you're going to need anywhere from 100 on the low end to 400 patients worth of data. These are general averages. But you get to say to your stakeholders, your investors, your KOLs, we have something that has never been seen in the US market before. And the FDA is an independent body to prove that, to say that.
And just because someone asked me earlier, KOL is key opinion leader.
Yes.
So you also mentioned breakthrough product programs. What are those?
So the exciting thing about the breakthrough designation program is this is a program that says you meet 2 main criteria. One is that you're serving a new or expanded patient population. There are some other criteria where you can show that with early clinical data that your safety and effectiveness is significantly better than anything else on the market. And in the prior administration, U.S. administration, there was additional reimbursement. And that was a cherry on top. With the new, that legislation has been rescinded, and there's talk of this current administration bringing that back in a new form. But the other benefit is you can tell the world that the FDA has not only said, generally speaking, there are de novo new products, but they also are breakthrough. The exciting thing that just happened last week is the FDA is incentivizing technologies that address health equity. So you can get breakthrough designation if your products addresses some health inequity in the US patient population. So there are multiple reasons to get a breakthrough designation, but I'll briefly talk about why you wouldn't want to do it. If you're working on a very lean budget, you will have to commit significant resources to go through these sprints with the FDA as part of the breakthrough process. There is no reimbursement currently, so you don't have the added benefit of guaranteed payment from CMS, and your time will be extended because on average, the breakthrough program takes about 80 days, and then the normal de novo program for the FDA takes about 150 days.
Ooh.
So you're adding time.
Yeah.
Some companies, about 50%, and we did some research on this again at UCLA, about 50% of companies still love the breakthrough program. About half of companies in the US said that, it's a cliche, the juices are worth the squeeze. They don't like breakthrough.
Is there something better or worse about it for startups versus established companies?
Thank you so much for asking it. In this environment, and the previous speakers talked about it, it's more money and time. That's the bottom line. So if you say we're thinking about raising $4 million and you find out you have breakthrough designation, you may want to add another $1 million to that budget. And for startups, you may not want to make that trade-off. You can change your indications, claims, et cetera, such that you're not breakthrough, so you could water down your technology. That may turn off certain stakeholders. So it's a real balancing act. And quite candidly, it's a hard decision to make. It's not checkers, it's chess. It's not a simple calculus. There are multiple factors, but those are some of the factors when you're thinking about breakthrough.
That was a lot of information very quickly. Are there questions about that?
Yes.
If you're looking at biopharma or drug development, how's that compare with the medtech space?
So it's more, it's funny. The previous speaker said she runs a tech bio firm, and she said, we have a small fund of $500 million. It's all relative, right? It's all relative. So in pharma, but I do have a good colleague. He was an investor at a pharma investment fund out of Boston. And the orders of magnitude of what constitutes a seed raise for medtech compared to pharma is 2 to 3x. So a typical medtech company, digital health company, may be raising $2 to $5 million for what they would call a seed raise. In pharma, that could be $5 to $10 million. And the time scale is a bit longer for pharma, but the exits tend to be earlier. For medtech companies, they may need to get into revenue. It's a different game. It's not apples and bananas. It's more like similar types of oranges and what do you call them? Sweeties or.
I was going to say apples and apple pie. I don't know why, but
yeah. And I'm fortunate enough to work closely with Monica, and in my consulting practice, I only deal with medtech, and that's for a reason, because the types of regulatory issues, they're not drastically different, but they're different enough that when you're looking for service provider partners, ideally you want to connect yourself with partners usually that focus on medtech or digital health or diagnostics, because there are differences.
And Felicia, we have to take your question.
So I'm excited about this. I'm going to write a whole piece. I'm going to post it on LinkedIn on how to future-proof your digital health company. And from the FDA's perspective, I think, well, I know, and I think you know this, there's a chart I'm going to show where the venture dollars in medtech, traditional medtech, have increased over the last 2 to 3 years, but it's been a hockey stick for digital health. I totally loved your comments about you still need high quality data for really significant softwares and medical device technologies. A good portion of them will need validation, and they're going to need validation and need to go through the FDA. Can you build an amazing software as a medical device company that doesn't have an FDA pathway? Yes, you can, right? Or kinda? Yes, you can. But sometimes you need to have a data set that's a randomized control study that has that level of rigor, and you have to get through the FDA.
Gil had a question too.
Thank you. What are you seeing in terms of the regulatory shift with consumer-facing medical devices? So the classic example is the Apple Watch, which is a mixed regulatory environment in itself, right? So
Yeah, so there are two things going on at a macro level. Companies like Apple, Google are hiring ex-FDA, people with regulatory experience that understand that framework because they have to go through that pathway. And there's a class of investors who don't understand D2C. They don't understand that pathway. So they will shy away from consumer-facing digital health products. There's a class of investors who understand the rigor of a product that may be consumer-facing but still has to go through the FDA, but they understand B2B or B2B2C. The sweet spot is this consumer-facing company who has a lead investor who understands CPG, whatever, that whole D2C world, and a healthcare investor to be a complementary yin to their yang. So I think, and we've seen that with my investor hat on, we've seen that a lot. And even the client base, they'll say, my lead investor understands D2C, but I have a co-investor who understands healthcare deeply, and he understands those long sales cycles if there's a B2B component to it later down the road.
So I'm really glad you brought up investors, because I think that's a really important consideration for all of you as you're moving forward. You're not just trying to get regulatory approval, but educate your investors and have them hopefully be partners along the way. I'm assuming some of our companies don't necessarily have investors who are educated in the regulatory process. What can they do to better make their investors partners in this process?
So there are different proof points and story points that the best CEOs tell. One is, we understand the path to these meaningful milestones, these value inflection points, and we've partnered with some of the best law firms, regulatory firms, quality firms to confirm what we thought is the milestones, the timelines, and the cost associated with it. So that's one education piece. Another is, you can invite your investor to have reference calls with people who you've trusted to handle your quality, handle your cybersecurity. That's a major issue for most companies that I work with nowadays. And your deck, there is a pretty classic deck where you talk about things like IP, regulatory, your roadmap that addresses when you're going to install your quality management system, when you're going to do your pilot clinical study, when you're going to do your pivotal clinical study, and all these things. Even if that investor doesn't live and breathe healthcare, they can see that you have a very thoughtful, rigorous process and story that you're telling.
Mm-hmm. So again, this sounds like a very complicated process. It is in some cases. What percentage of applicants actually get market clearance?
So here's the good news. At the FDA, the legislation called MDUFMA, user fees, are incentivized, one, for the reviewers to review in a timely fashion and resolve matters. And over 95% of companies that apply a 510K will get clearance. So once you get in the system, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. That's the good news. Now, are there situations, I'm gonna tell you the other dirty little secret. Do companies sometimes withdraw their application when they know they're not gonna get a clearance? Yes. But generally speaking, the FDA gives, and they're trained on this, to give you clear questions that describe what you provided, what was wrong with what you provided, what they need to see to correct whatever they think is wrong, and why. It's called 4-part harmony. It's something that all reviewers are trained on. And if it's unclear, you can even say, hey, FDA, you still didn't communicate it clearly. I don't understand. You can have a meeting with the FDA to figure it out.
How much of that is public information? Because when you mentioned pulling it back, I can imagine someone going, oh, I don't want someone to know I'm doing badly at this process.
Yeah. So this is why a regulatory consultant can charge you anywhere from $300 an hour to $1,300 an hour. There's a massive information the FDA has put out, but none of you should be spending your time trying to digest these guidances, regulations, and policies, because the FDA is known to promulgate the largest quantity of information. So my best advice, doesn't have to be my firm, but work with someone whose day job it is to digest this information. It's called regulatory intelligence, and give you concise, consolidated opinions based on them scanning the universe of regulatory information from the FDA on a regular basis.
And I assume that actually saves you time and money at the end.
Right. So there are two flavors of CEOs that I come across. The one is we bootstrapped. We did a pre-seed of $250,000. We want to spend $20,000 on regulatory to get me through a de novo, right? And I don't work with those companies because they're a type of bootstrapping, blue-collar, hardworking medtech digital health CEO. They're going to get to their finish line, but it's going to take longer than if they spent the money, made the investment to work with someone who lives and breathes this. And there are people who geek out on this.
Yeah.
And it will shorten your timeline in the long run.
Are there other things that people can do to shorten the timeline?
So there's this issue that we learned from our research of reimbursement. And to the extent possible, there's a team that you can have on your side, and ideally you have on your side even at the seed round. It's a clinical partner, regulatory partner, quality partner, and someone to help you with an initial reimbursement strategy. And if you can write a clinical protocol that satisfies the FDA and hopefully has an endpoint or two that can drive reimbursement for either CMS or private payers, you're ahead of the game. I talked about it briefly, but clearly the assumption is you're going to have great technical service providers on your team, software, biomechanical engineers, all those people. But the teammates that most of the people I work with give second priority to that are as important is clinical, regulatory, quality, and reimbursement.
Let's just pause there for a moment and talk about reimbursement. I know that's not really part of this, but sometimes I hear about people who are so worried about approval, they don't worry about reimbursement. At what point should they start investigating the reimbursement side?
I would say I would dedicate part of the seed raise to some preliminary reimbursement strategy, because a savvy healthcare investor is going to ask, do you have a code that you can get paid on? What type of is it DRG? They're going to ask you these questions, and you should be able to answer those minimum questions. Or answer why you have a cash pay model and why you think you can be a high growth company without reimbursement, and have a really cogent story. And then by your Series A, you're talking about the clinical evidence for reimbursement, and you're talking about a full regulatory strategy, and you have outlined the first 1 or 2 clinical studies that you're going to use post clearance or de novo granting to get reimbursement.
Thank you. I'm going to pause again. Questions?
Oh, thanks. So following up on the question that Gil asked about consumer-facing products, is there a viable strategy here for basically downgrading your products that you can skirt the whole FDA process? Because it seems like you gain so much in time and also expense if you were to just put out something a little watered down.
So I will give you a story. It's a real story. I'm going to be like my buddy. They're not in stealth. They're not in stealth. I was going to try to throw stealth. I want to invest in that company, by the way, where you just need one. I got tired of my boosters. I don't know who else got tired of their booster shots. They partner with a large Japanese pharmaceutical company. They're a digital health company, and their first JV is for a wellness. Actually, it's a device that's operating under. It's a wellness device. So they have 2 versions of their product. And what they did, because they're working with a Japanese pharmaceutical, the Japanese pharmaceutical is putting up the money. So they took a very conservative approach. So they actually went to the FDA, said, here's our digital health product that we think does not require an FDA application. Do you agree? And this is this application called the 513G. The FDA came back and said, if you make these claims, and have this indications for use, this product does not need an FDA application. So they're going to get to market quicker. And then their next version, they're meeting with the FDA, say it's up, I use the term upregulated. They say, oh, this is a version with these claims that are expanded, stronger health outcomes. And that is the one that's going to have to go through a de novo process. So there absolutely is that critical decision that I've seen this happen on multiple occasions where digital health companies say we want to be down regulated, we want to get to market quicker as a wellness device, or they operate under what's called enforcement discretion. Either way, they can sell their product without going through a formal FDA application.
Thanks, Kwame. The question I had was on timeline, which you had brought up. You talked about 2.5 years for a 510K, but you also made the comment that after the pre-submission there are a lot of cycles that occur. So my question is, when you go through a pre-submission and you can get the FDA to specify clearly what the clinical studies are that need to be met, why is it that you need to go through more cycles? Is it because the startup does not deliver to those numbers, or is it the technology that creates a new set of requirements?
So we worked with a digital health company that went 2 cycles with the FDA. As soon as they had clarity on their pivotal clinical study, they said, we're not going back anymore. And I think that made a lot of sense. So to answer your question, typically the big question is my clinical protocol appropriate? Do I have the right endpoints? And once companies get that answer from the FDA, they go back to their investors, say, we have a de-risk pathway, we're not going back anymore. And investors no one really wants multiple iterations with the FDA if they can avoid it. So to answer your question directly, you can stop after you get that feedback on the clinical protocol. And normally you don't have any remaining major questions.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So moving on to sort of tips and tricks. So what would you say is the biggest mistake that you see people do when they're on this pathway?
I would say, getting back to my earlier comment, they decide to use their time to read up on the regulations, try and learn it on their own. And even though these timelines are on the order of years, this still is a high growth VC-backed industry in general. And the biggest mistake is trying to do it your own. The second biggest mistake is for really breakthrough technologies. That's normally the companies I work with, not doing a pre-submission to de-risk the clinical path. And that normally is the biggest time sink. And that's the discussion that it is worth your time to meet with the FDA. And I worked at the FDA for 12 years, so I have a bias. So you need to put your filter on for me with that. But I wrote 10 reasons why you should meet with the FDA. And one of them is to de-risk your pathway for your investors.
Fantastic. And I just wanted to reemphasize for that. I work, because of the work I do in intellectual property, I've worked with a lot of different agencies. I would just say people in agencies are always more accessible and more available to answer questions than we all think they're going to be. So, other questions?
So how does the FDA enforce for
So I'll talk about a couple things. So there's a group of people at the FDA who monitor websites, and they will look for false, misleading claims. And if there's a real public health impact, negative, they will contact you in what's called an untitled letter. It's the first nice letter in a series of increasingly not nice letters they send. But I had to do a report on this report from the FDA on the pre-certification program. And one of the findings was for software companies that are constantly iterating and changing, the regulatory framework is insufficient. So the concept is, I can't wait, this is going to be part of future-proofing your digital health company, is for a software company that's iterating on a regular basis. The FDA is seeking legislative authority to empower a good housekeeping seal of approval so that if you adhere to these, it's called excellence appraisal KPIs. There's about 15 KPIs. If your company can adhere to them, they're things like How do you address and remove software bugs and defects? How do you handle complaints? If you can show that you have a robust system and culture of quality, the FDA will say you need less information for your 510K or potentially need to submit less, not as many 510Ks. So that's in the future. The last thing I'll say is, as a regulated digital health company, you have the legal obligation to report on adverse events, and that's how FDA finds out about it. It is a trust and verify process. In other words, the FDA expects the company to have someone called a complaint handler. This is this person's job, in part or in full, to just take in feedback and determine whether it's a complaint that is an adverse event that needs to be reported to the FDA.
So that made me think of a question. So,
Yes.
so Felicia and Monica talked about data and security. Is cybersecurity or some sort of security plan often a part of these submissions, or is that a separate issue?
So by far, it is the largest set of questions that my clients get is in cybersecurity. If you have a software product that is moving patient data to the cloud, you can expect on the low end, when you're interacting with the FDA, 2 to 5 questions. On the high end, you may get into the double digits. So the take home for me is when I work with companies, one of the first 5 to 10 questions is, do you have a cybersecurity expert on that? And that's where we are as an industry. Yeah.
Really neat. Gentleman in the back.
Just a follow-up question to that around security and also data integrity. Is the FDA exploring technologies like blockchain, for example? I'm starting to see clients looking for maybe putting medical devices, maybe wrapping that around blockchain for security purposes and also to track and validate patient data so that it's accessible in various locations.
So I have a bias because I worked there for quite a long time. I would be a little surprised if there's a blockchain expert within the FDA, but I would say there are software experts, and they will do their best to apply the existing regulatory framework to evaluate a company that has blockchain as part of their system. I think it probably would make the Wall Street Journal if there was a regulated product that was powered by blockchain. I probably would have heard about it. There may have been, but definitely it's the bleeding edge. Yeah. Yes. Well, I don't know if any that have blockchain as an element have gone through the FDA quite yet. It seems that's early days. Most of my clients are AI ML powered. I haven't seen a lot of them that said with blockchain and, oh yeah, we're about to get 510K clearance or de novo.
So how soon after FDA approval do startups go through the audit process? Or like how does the FDA handle auditing for smaller companies as they scale? Yeah, so it's a risk-based approach. And many, many years ago when I had hair, I worked at the San Francisco district office and we would go out and inspect facilities. But generally they're for your high-risk devices called PMA devices. Think pacemakers, defibrillators. For lower risk products, you won't get inspected sometimes for, if you're going through what's called the 510K process, sometimes not for 12 to 24 months after you've gotten that clearance.
Other questions?
I actually have one. I'll start by saying I was really impressed by the FDA's response to COVID and the flexibility that was shown there. And as we talk about some of these new processes being put in place around software and the rapid pace of innovation, are there other changes that you're aware of that you can speak to around how the FDA interfaces with these innovators today?
So the FDA, I think, is going to continue to. There's a chart that I'm going to put out on the promulgation of guidance for digital health, and it's gone linear, not hyperbolic. But I think it's going to continue to be, on average, 5 to 10 guidances just on digital health per year, and with what's called user fees. This is actually regulated companies pay a fee, if you're pharma, biotech, or medtech. And those fees help to pay for more staff such that if we have another emergency, another crisis, hopefully there won't be as much of a backlog. Because the one bad thing that happened during COVID is the FDA's review staff was strained. But with this new advent of user fees, there's going to be more staff to be able to digest and hopefully review even quicker now.
And I'd just add, Kwame and I were both at the AdvaMed MedTech conference last week, and they had a lot of speakers from the FDA. And I was really impressed by how much they recognized that everything that's going on with digital health, AI, ML, all of software, everything is an evolving field, and they need to try and keep up with it. So I'd say that they really understand, and I'm glad they have a mechanism for bringing people in. All right.
I think we're wrapping up, but I just want to add really quickly, there's actually even a mechanism when the FDA doesn't have the expertise to hire what's called special government employees. And these are people they are KOLs who are out in the world who will get paid by the government to answer these questions where there aren't any internal expertise to handle.
So I was going to ask you for any last words.
No, I just love doing this stuff with you, Dina.
Oh, thank you. I do too with you.
That's right.
I have specific last word requests. Will you tell us a little bit more about Medtech Impact Partners?
We've been operating for 5 years now, and we decided early on to provide regulatory strategy, a guide through the FDA, and a series of tools, some of them technology, to make your process efficient and painless. So we have a platform to have an error-free application to the FDA. We have team members who can speak Mandarin. So if you're a Chinese entity wanting to enter the FDA, we can speak to you in your language, and a series of SOPs so that we, based on our 30 years of experience, can go through a project plan that's most efficient for your pre-submission 510(k) de novo. But thank you, and the check is in the mail. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dina.